Right now, as you watch this, something is happening to your mind. Not a virus, not a disease, something far more insidious. A psychologist who survived Nazi interrogation camps and studied Soviet brainwashing coined a term for what he witnessed: menticide, the systematic killing of the mind. And here's what terrifies me. It's happening to millions of people right now, and they have no idea. You think you're thinking your own thoughts. You believe your opinions are yours. But what if I told you there's a method, refined over decades by totalitarian regimes, designed specifically to make you incapable of thinking at all? Your mind is dying. Joost Meerloo watched it happen in real time. He saw intelligent adults reduced to compliant children. He documented exactly how it works. And today, I'm going to show you the 10 stages of menticide, how they're being deployed in modern society, and most importantly, how to protect yourself before it's too late. This is not conspiracy. This is documented psychology. And by the end of this video, you'll never see the world the same way again. The rape of mind. In 1956, a Dutch psychologist named Joost Meerloo published a book that should have changed history. It was called The Rape of the Mind. Meerloo wasn't theorizing from an ivory tower. He had been captured by the Nazis, subjected to interrogation, and witnessed firsthand how totalitarian regimes don't just control bodies, they colonize minds. The totalitarian system gradually breaks down the individual's integration, his sense of identity, his self-image. What he discovered terrified him. There was a systematic method to destroying human thought, not through violence alone, but through psychological techniques that bypass rational thinking entirely. He called it menticide, the killing of the mind. Think about that word for a moment. Menticide. We have words for killing the body: homicide, suicide, genocide. But Meerloo realized we needed a word for something even more sinister: the destruction of a person's ability to think independently while leaving their body perfectly intact. A walking corpse of compliance. And the most disturbing part, the victim often doesn't know it's happening. They believe they've arrived at their conclusions freely, when in reality, their capacity for independent thought has been systematically dismantled. But how does it begin? Waves of terror. The first weapon of menticide isn't bullets or bombs. It's fear. But not just any fear. Carefully orchestrated waves of terror that never let you rest. Meerloo observed that totalitarian regimes don't maintain constant maximum fear. That would numb people. Instead, they create rhythms of terror. Periods of intense threat followed by temporary relief, then escalation again. Fear, relief, fear again. This cycle does something devastating to the human psyche. It creates a state of chronic uncertainty. Your nervous system never fully relaxes. You're always waiting for the next wave. And a brain under constant threat stress cannot think critically. It can only react. Neuroscience now confirms what Meerloo observed. Chronic fear activates the amygdala and suppresses the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for rational analysis, long-term planning, and critical thinking. A frightened population is an obedient population. Think about your own life. How many waves of fear have you experienced in recent years? Each one demanding your attention, your compliance, your trust in authority figures who promise safety. If this is resonating uncomfortably, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring the depths of your psyche with me, because understanding this is your first line of defense. But fear is only the beginning of the process. Mental fatigue. Here's something Meerloo noticed that most people miss. Menticide doesn't require concentration camps. It requires exhaustion. When the human mind is perpetually tired, it loses its capacity for complex thought. Nuance becomes impossible. Black and white thinking takes over. The tired brain is a brain that cannot resist suggestion. Totalitarian interrogators knew this. They would deprive prisoners of sleep, bombard them with contradictory information, and create conditions of perpetual mental fatigue. But you don't need a prison cell to create this effect. Consider your modern life, the endless scroll of information, the constant notifications, the 24-hour news cycle designed to keep you engaged, alarmed, and mentally depleted. Your brain is running on empty. When was the last time you felt truly mentally rested? When did you last have the energy for deep, sustained thought about complex issues? Meerloo found that mentally exhausted people don't just make poor decisions. They actively seek out simple explanations and strong authority figures to do their thinking for them. A tired mind wants certainty. It craves someone confident to tell them what's true. And that vulnerability is exactly what menticide exploits. But there's an even more insidious technique: logic destruction. This is where menticide becomes truly terrifying. The goal isn't to make you believe a specific lie. It's to destroy your ability to know what's true at all. Meerloo called it the destruction of the logical faculty. Truth becomes impossible. Here's how it works. You're bombarded with contradictory information from sources that should be authoritative. Experts contradict experts. Facts from yesterday become misinformation today. What was conspiracy becomes accepted truth, then becomes conspiracy again. The psychological effect is devastating. Your brain eventually gives up trying to determine what's real. When everything could be true, nothing is true. This is the precise goal. Not to convince you of a particular narrative, but to make you so confused, so disoriented, that you stop trusting your own ability to evaluate information. And once that happens, something terrifying occurs. You default to whoever speaks with the most confidence and authority. Because in a world where you can't trust your own judgment, you have no choice but to trust someone else's. Surrender. The death of critical thinking isn't sudden. It's a slow drowning in an ocean of contradiction. And speaking of contradiction, there's a specific technique used to accelerate this process: conditioned reflex. You've heard of Pavlov's dogs. Ring a bell, dog salivates. Simple conditioning. But Meerloo witnessed this technique applied to human minds on a mass scale. The totalitarian regimes he studied didn't just punish wrong behavior. They trained populations to have automatic emotional reactions to specific words, symbols, and ideas. The conditioned reflex prevents genuine reflection. Think about certain words in today's discourse. Before I even finish saying them, you already have an emotional reaction. Your body tenses or relaxes. You categorize the speaker as friend or enemy, all before a single argument is made. You're not thinking, you're reacting. This is conditioning in action. Through repetition, certain stimulus-response patterns become automatic. The conditioned person doesn't evaluate ideas on their merit. They simply react based on trained associations. Meerloo observed prisoners who, after enough conditioning, couldn't even think forbidden thoughts. The emotional pain response triggered automatically, shutting down the thought before it could fully form. Thought equals pain. Now consider how many emotional triggers have been installed in your mind through years of exposure to media, education, and social pressure. How many ideas can you not even consider without an immediate visceral reaction? This conditioning serves a crucial purpose in the menticide process. Childlike minds. Here's perhaps the most disturbing observation Meerloo made. Under sustained psychological pressure, adults regress to childlike mental states. This isn't metaphor, it's documented psychology. Adults become children seeking parental protection. When the mind is exhausted, frightened, and confused, it retreats to earlier developmental stages. Complex adult reasoning gives way to black and white thinking. Nuance disappears. There are only good people and bad people, safety and danger, us and them. The regressed mind craves authority figures. Just as a frightened child looks to a parent for guidance and protection, the psychologically regressed adult looks to leaders, experts, and institutions to tell them what to think and do. Meerloo witnessed this in concentration camps. Intelligent, accomplished adults reduced to obedient children, desperate for approval from their captors. But he also saw it happening in free societies under different kinds of pressure. A population in a state of regression cannot govern itself. They need someone to tell them what's safe and dangerous, what's true and false, what to think, say, and do. And there's always someone willing to fill that role. But this regression doesn't happen by accident. Isolation weapon. Meerloo observed that menticide requires isolation. Not necessarily physical isolation, though that helps, but something more profound: the destruction of genuine human connection. Alone in a crowd. In totalitarian societies, trust itself becomes dangerous. You never know who might report your words. Even family members become potential threats. This creates a terrifying paradox. You're surrounded by people but profoundly alone in your thoughts. When you can't share your genuine perceptions with others, you lose the ability to reality test. One of the great protections against menticide is human solidarity. Think about your own relationships. How many people can you truly speak your mind to? How many thoughts do you censor before they leave your lips, not from wisdom but from fear? Social isolation does something specific to the psyche. It makes you doubt your own perceptions. Without trusted others to confirm your reality, you become increasingly dependent on official sources of truth. Connection is your last defense. This is why every totalitarian movement works to atomize society, to break bonds of family, friendship, and community. Because isolated individuals are infinitely easier to manipulate than connected groups. But isolation is just one technique among many. Language poison. George Orwell wrote about Newspeak in 1984, but Meerloo documented the real thing: the corruption of language as a tool of menticide. When you control language, you control the very categories through which people can think. Semanticide. Meerloo coined another term: semanticide, the killing of meaning. Words lose their connection to reality. They become weapons rather than tools for understanding. Consider how many words have become ideological landmines. Terms that once had clear meanings now trigger immediate emotional reactions and social consequences. The effect is exactly what menticide requires. When words become dangerous, thoughts become impossible. You find yourself avoiding certain ideas not because you've evaluated and rejected them, but because the words to express them have become too costly to use. This is a form of thought control that doesn't require a police state. It operates through social pressure, public shaming, and professional consequences. Words become weapons. Meerloo watched sophisticated adults tie themselves in linguistic knots, trying to express simple observations while avoiding forbidden terminology. The mental energy spent on word policing leaves none for actual critical thinking. But there's one more technique that ties it all together: the big voice. In every case of mass menticide, there's one constant: a single authorized voice that drowns out all others. Meerloo called it the big voice. The constant, repetitive communication that becomes the only reality. The barrage of opinion drowns the individual capacity for judgment. In totalitarian regimes, this was state-controlled media. The same messages repeated endlessly until they felt like obvious truth. Disagreement didn't just feel wrong. It felt insane, like arguing that the sky is green when everyone around you insists it's blue. But you don't need government ownership to create a big voice. You just need sufficient coordination. One message everywhere. When every major institution, every platform, every respected voice repeats the same talking points, the psychological effect is identical to state propaganda. It becomes not just difficult to disagree, but nearly impossible to even formulate disagreement. The big voice works because of a simple truth about human psychology. We're social animals. We take cues from our environment about what's real and acceptable. When the entire environment speaks with one voice, resistance feels like madness. And that's exactly the point. The goal is to make independent thought feel not just wrong, but psychologically unbearable. But here's what Meerloo discovered that changes everything: your defense. Meerloo didn't just document the disease. He found the cure. And it's simpler than you might expect. The antidote to menticide is mental awareness combined with genuine human connection. Consciousness itself becomes resistant. Once you see the techniques, they lose much of their power. Fear waves still come, but you recognize them for what they are. Contradictory information still flows, but you understand its purpose. Conditioned reactions still trigger, but you catch yourself before surrendering to them. 1. Name the technique when you see it. 2. Seek out genuine human connection. 3. Protect time for deep, slow thinking. 4. Question automatic emotional reactions. 5. Trust your own capacity for judgment. Meerloo found that even in concentration camps, some individuals maintained their psychological integrity. They did so through small acts of mental resistance, holding onto their identity, refusing to surrender their inner life even when they had to comply outwardly. The free mind cannot be conquered. It can only be surrendered. You cannot control the external waves of propaganda and fear, but you can control your response to them. You can choose to think slowly when the world demands immediate reaction. You can choose genuine connection over atomized isolation. You can choose to protect your mind. Because here's what Meerloo knew above all else. Menticide is not inevitable. It requires your participation. It requires you to stay frightened, stay exhausted, stay isolated, and stay silent. The moment you become aware of the process, you've already begun to resist it. The courage to think for oneself is the foundation of all freedom. Meerloo survived Nazi interrogation. He watched totalitarian regimes collapse, and he documented one consistent truth. Systems of mental control are more fragile than they appear. They depend on the illusion of unanimity. They depend on your belief that everyone agrees, that resistance is futile, that you are alone in your doubts. But you're not alone. Every person who refuses to surrender their thinking is a crack in the system. Every genuine conversation is an act of resistance. Every moment of slow, careful thought is a victory. Your mind is yours. If you made it this far, comment menticide aware if you refuse to surrender your capacity for independent thought. The sleeping mind can be killed. The awakened mind cannot be touched. Welcome to the Psyche Project. If this opened your eyes, subscribe for more. Understanding yourself is the work of a lifetime.